Christians, this question is fantastic. It's a great question. He asked me to explain, quote unquote, what both is referring to in John chapter 12, verse 28. Let me read that verse. Jesus says, Father, glorify your name. And then the Father's voice came from heaven saying, I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. So now, in John chapter 11, we see this circumstances surrounding the death and resurrection of Lazarus. And you will see in chapter 11, verse 4, when Jesus found out about Lazarus, he said that his sickness, that Lazarus' sickness was not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. So that is the first one. Then in John chapter 12, you start to see in verse 23, Christ explaining his own death and resurrection. So he says in verse 23, Jesus answered them saying, the hour has come that the Son of Man should be glorified. And then he goes on and talks about a grain of wheat falling into the ground must happen in order for it to be glorified. In other words, the seed must be put into the ground so that it can sprout its glorified outcome. He was speaking about himself. He's the seed who would be put into the ground and springing forth the glory of God. So when Jesus says in verse 28, Father, glorify your name, and when God says, I have both glorified it and will glorify it again, the first time he is speaking about Lazarus, raising Lazarus from the dead to glorify God. And then now he's speaking about glorifying it again with the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Both times. So both refers to him getting glory from the resurrection of Lazarus, and then second time getting glory from the resurrection of himself. I hope that answers the question. But if you read John chapter 11 and this chapter, it makes sense. And then you'll also see in Romans chapter 6, verse 4, it says, therefore they were buried with him in baptism unto death, that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father.